It was a tale in a Thanksgiving weekend, 1992. A gray Sunday evening draped over suburban Atlanta like a wet wool coat. Families were returning home, kids yawning in the back seats, and the streets of Marietta, Georgia, glowed dimly under street lamps that buzzed with indifference. In the driveway of an upscale, two-story house nestled in a quiet cul-de-sac, a white SUV rolled to a stop. Behind the wheel, Sarah Tokars, 39, mother of two, wife of a prominent attorney. She'd just driven her boys, aged 6 and 4, all the way back from Florida, where they'd spent the holiday with her parents. But someone was already waiting in the shadows. The house was dark. No porch lights. No welcome. Just a subtle stillness, too quiet for comfort. As Sarah stepped in the vehicle, still groggy from the long drive, the nightmare began. A man, faceless in the dark, emerged. He wasn't there to rob or talk or scare. He was holding a weapon. Short, brutal, sawed-off, like something out of a pirate story. At least, that's how her 6-year-old would later describe it. The stranger forced her back into the car. The two boys, unaware, were in the back. Sarah, panicked, trembling, drove as instructed, deeper into the night, her children breathing heavily beside her. They stopped on a deserted construction road. Empty, isolated. Then, without ceremony, without a word, the man pressed a shotgun to her head and pulled the trigger. Sarah's body slumped forward, lifeless. The car idled to a roll. Her 6-year-old son reached across her corpse, shut off the ignition, and unbuckled his little brother. The boys, alone, wandered in the darkness until they found a porch light and rang a stranger's doorbell. A neighbor called 911. Within minutes, police descended on the scene, and soon the FBI would too. The case had all the hallmarks of a senseless act of violence, a carjacking, perhaps a burglary gone sideways. But within hours, agents would find cracks in that theory, tiny inconsistencies, strange absences, and one particularly unusual clue. Nothing was taken from the house. Not the jewelry, not the electronics, not the cash. Only Sarah. She was a target. And the deeper the bureau looked, the darker the shadows around her life became. The victim's husband, Fred Tokars, was a name known in every courthouse in Atlanta. Criminal defense attorney, municipal judge, political insider, a man who knew the system and knew how to manipulate it. When news reached him, Fred was out of town. Montgomery, Alabama, they said, visiting a client behind bars. He returned to Atlanta by morning, already flanked by his personal attorney, already prepared for questions. Investigators noted how controlled he seemed, how quickly he explained his alibi, how efficiently he distanced himself. He never asked, not once, how his wife had died. Inside the Tokars' home, things weren't adding up. The security alarm was off, despite the family's usual routine. A dowel rod meant to block the sliding door was lying on the floor. There was no sign of forced entry. Downstairs, a safe sat open empty, but Tokars couldn't say how much money had been in it, or whether anything was actually missing. It looked staged, like someone had tried to simulate a robbery, but didn't know the part. The coroner's report was chilling. The weapon, a .410 sawed-off shotgun, small but devastating, had been pressed directly to the victim's skull. It fit the description her 6-year-old gave detectives. A pirate gun. The killer hadn't left fingerprints. No shell casings. No clothing fibers. Not a single breadcrumb. This was no random crime. This was orchestrated. And as the pressure mounted, both from the public and from within, Cobb County officials turned to the one agency equipped for complex conspiracies like this: the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The Bureau didn't waste time. They started where they always start, the paper trail. Within days, Sarah's sister and cousin walked into the local precinct, holding a manila folder filled with documents. It was Sarah's insurance plan, in a way, her last defense. She had handed her sister these papers 3 years before. If anything happens to me, she'd said, give this to the police. Inside were pages of bank statements, offshore accounts, dummy corporations, financial ledgers that didn't make sense. She had copied them from Fred's files, secretly and deliberately. She believed he was laundering money. And now she was dead. This was the moment the story pivoted. The FBI wasn't just looking at a murder anymore. They were staring at the perimeter of something wider, deeper, a criminal enterprise, hidden beneath the polished shoes and courtroom charm of a well-connected lawyer. As agents followed the money, traced the calls, and scrutinized Fred Tokar's past, they would uncover a plot so calculated, so cold-blooded, it would shake even the most seasoned investigators. Because this wasn't just about greed. It was about control, about power, about a man who believed that if he couldn't keep his wife quiet, he could at least silence her forever. As winter crept across Georgia and yellow tape faded from the crime scene, the investigation shifted from murder to motive. The FBI had one question burning at the core of every lead. Why would someone want Sarah Tokar's dead? And the closer they looked at her husband, Fred, the more the mask began to slip. On the surface, Fred Tokar's was a picture of prestige, a successful attorney, a former assistant district attorney, even a municipal judge in Cobb County. He wore tailored suits and moved easily through Atlanta's legal and political circles. He taught seminars to law enforcement on financial crime, even money laundering. But behind that polished veneer, agents began uncovering something else entirely. Offshore accounts, shell companies, nominee owners listed on legal paperwork, bars and nightclubs that looked legit, but moved cash like a laundering machine. It was all there in the records Sarah had hidden from him. The Bureau cross-referenced those documents. The names, the signatures, the dates. They weren't guessing. They were building a case. Sarah hadn't just stumbled onto Fred's secret business dealings. She had confronted him. And that was a mistake that may have cost her life. According to her closest friends and family, Sarah had grown increasingly frightened in the months before her death. She wanted out, but Fred made it clear. If she divorced him, he'd use his legal clout to take the kids, ruin her finances, and bury her in court. He said she had no chance, no leverage. So she made her own. She began collecting his records. Quietly, methodically, she found bank statements, dummy corporations, hidden income, evidence, or what she believed was evidence, that could bring him down. She shared them with her sister, made copies, held on to them, just in case. And then she made her move. 2 weeks before her murder, Sarah confided in a neighbor. She found what she called the goods, proof that Fred was involved in tax evasion and criminal finance. She planned to go to the authorities, to file for divorce, take her children, and expose what she knew. She was done being afraid. But Fred Tokar's, the seasoned lawyer with clients in the drug underworld, knew what exposure meant. Not just embarrassment, not just scandal. Prison. At this point, the FBI widened their scope. They weren't just looking at Fred. They were examining everyone in his orbit. And that's when they found Eddie Lawrence, a slick-talking businessman with a background in real estate and renovation. Fred had represented him in court. They'd gone into business together, on paper at least. But Eddie had a different reputation on the street. He'd bounce checks, burn bridges, and, as the Bureau would soon learn, he'd been asking around about something far more sinister. A hitman. Tip-offs began surfacing. Quiet whispers from the underworld. Eddie had offered someone cash, good money, to take care of a woman who was causing problems. He didn't say a name, but he made it clear she had to go. FBI agents brought Lawrence in for questioning. He played it cool, said all his calls to Tokar's were just business, denied everything. But his alibi had holes, and he was nervous. When they let him go, on a minor fraud charge, they watched the ripple effect. And sure enough, it worked. A confidential informant stepped forward. He knew the name, Curtis Rower, a two-bit hustler, ex-con, strung out, desperate. He'd done armed robbery before, and now he needed cash. Fast. According to the informant, Eddie Lawrence had hired Rower to carry out the job. It was Sarah Tokar's. The FBI moved fast. A search warrant, a SWAT knock. They found Curtis Rower in a rundown house in College Park. Hidden, but not well. He confessed quickly, at least to part of it. He said he'd followed Sarah home, waited in the dark, forced her to drive. But when it came time to pull the trigger, he froze. Then he claimed Eddie Lawrence. The man who set it up ran up from the shadows, shouting for him to finish it. In the chaos, the shotgun went off. Sarah was gone. The Bureau didn't buy all of Rower's story, but they had enough. They charged him with murder. And Eddie Lawrence? Conspiracy to commit murder. But the man who'd orchestrated it all, who sat miles away with clean hands and plausible deniability, was still walking free. Fred Tokars. The trail led to him. The motive pointed to him. But they needed more, because to charge a man like Fred, to win against his army of lawyers and his high society connections, the FBI needed ironclad evidence, and they were about to find it, not in a crime scene, not in a confession, but in the company he kept and the mistakes he didn't even know he'd made. In the aftermath of the arrests, the case was gaining heat and headlines. The names were public now. Curtis Rower, the triggerman. Eddie Lawrence, the broker. But at the top of this pyramid, the man with the law degree, the clean shirt cuffs, and the frozen smile, Fred Tokars? He was still untouched. But not for long. The Bureau watched him closely. They weren't waiting for a mistake. They were creating the conditions that would make one inevitable. Agents understood something Fred hadn't figured out yet. Guilt doesn't just rot in silence. It screams in the gaps between words. So they put pressure on the cracks, starting with Eddie Lawrence. Lawrence was a man used to smooth suits and easy lies, but now he was caged. No more handshakes. No more get-out-of-trouble favors from his lawyer friend. He'd gone from backroom deals to steel bars and a concrete schedule. And it was working on him. 7 months behind bars, the walls started to whisper. Finally, he broke. The call came into the U.S. Attorney's office. Lawrence was ready to talk, but he had conditions: protection and a reduced sentence. The FBI agreed. The deal was sealed in a safe house, miles from the headlines. The agents made sure no one else knew, not even Fred. What Lawrence told them peeled back the final layer of the Tokars myth. The businesses, the real estate flips, the flashy partnerships, they were all a smokescreen. Fred Tokars was deep into laundering money for Atlanta's cocaine elite. He was an advisor, a shield, the man who knew exactly how to turn dirty dollars into clean assets, fast and off the books. And it didn't stop at paperwork. Fred had used Lawrence to scout for drug clients, cash-heavy, desperate, and dangerous. Fred created the corporations. Lawrence found the money. Together, they moved thousands, maybe millions, through nightclubs, bogus construction firms, and offshore havens. But Sarah? Sarah was the one problem Fred couldn't balance in the ledger. She knew what he was doing. She had copies. She'd made threats. And worse, she meant them. Lawrence told the Bureau that Fred was terrified, not of losing money, but of losing control. So he made a decision. He offered Lawrence $25,000 to have Sarah eliminated, not in secret, not at a distance, but up close, in front of her children. "They'll get over it," Fred had said. Those 4 words hung in the room like smoke. Cold, calculated, chilling. Lawrence couldn't do it himself. But he knew someone who could. Curtis Rower, a man with debts, no conscience, and a price tag. Lawrence gave him $5,000 up front. The rest, he said, would come after. From Fred. It was all arranged. The timing, the location, even the fact that Fred would be out of town, provided himself with a pristine alibi. Sarah never had a chance. With this confession, the FBI had everything they needed to charge Fred Tokars, but they had to be smart about it, because by now Fred was paranoid. He'd moved his children to Florida, surrounded himself with lawyers, refused to speak to reporters or the police. Cameras stalked his every move. If they arrested him in the open, someone might get hurt, or worse, someone might disappear. So they came up with a plan. Agents knew Fred couldn't stand the media. He hated being watched, hated the lens. So one morning, they staged it. Plainclothes agents parked near his residence, pretending to be reporters. It worked. Fred came storming out to confront them and walked right into custody. They had him. The mastermind, the architect, the man who thought he was above it all. Now he was just another suspect in federal custody. The charges came swift and heavy: racketeering, money laundering, murder for hire, conspiracy to commit murder. He pled not guilty, of course, but the walls were already closing in, because now the jury wouldn't just hear from cops and agents. They'd hear from his own business partner. And Lawrence, now under oath, would describe in slow, unforgiving detail how Fred Tokars turned a divorce into a death sentence and paid for it like it was just another line item on a spreadsheet. By the time the federal trial began, the courtroom was already thick with tension, not just from the gravity of the crime, but from who was on trial. Fred Tokars wasn't just some small-time hustler. He'd once lectured law enforcement on money laundering, a man who had taught others how to chase criminals, now being chased by them. But the FBI knew the game had changed. This wasn't about catching a man in the act. This was about proving a criminal empire existed beneath a suit and tie. And they were ready. The prosecution strategy was bold. They weren't just trying to prove a single murder. They were using the RICO Act, a powerful legal weapon originally forged to dismantle organized crime, racketeering, conspiracy, financial corruption, and yes, murder for hire. Fred Tokars wasn't being charged like a jealous husband. He was being charged like a mob boss. The FBI's case unfolded like clockwork. First came the paper trail, the offshore bank accounts, the shell companies, the nominee owners, all linked, all deliberate. Then came the drug ties, names, faces, transactions, nightclubs and businesses registered under aliases, flowing with cash that never seemed to touch the IRS. The agents laid out diagrams, spreadsheets, telephone logs, surveillance timelines, cold, calculated data, building a portrait of a man who lived double lives with double ledgers. But the showstopper? Eddie Lawrence. He took the stand with a plea deal in his pocket and a story that turned the courtroom silent. He told the jury how Fred Tokars recruited him, how he was coached on which clients to approach, which drug dealers had the right mix of paranoia and profit, how Fred set up the businesses, collected the payments, and laundered the money like it was routine. And then Eddie told him about the murder. He spoke plainly, not like a villain, but like a man who'd run out of lies. He told him how Fred wanted Sarah silenced before she could go to authorities, how he offered him $25,000 to make her go away, how Fred insisted on doing it in front of kids to send a message, and how, when Eddie said he couldn't go through with it, Fred replied, "I worked too hard to let her take it all." The defense tried to discredit Lawrence, called him a crook, a liar, a man willing to say anything for a lighter sentence. But the jury wasn't just listening to Eddie. They were watching the FBI's evidence stack up, phone records linking Fred to Curtis Rower through payphones and third parties, surveillance photos of meetings between Eddie and Rower before the murder, financial documents showing Fred's offshore holdings, hidden from tax filings, hidden from Sarah, and a suicide note written by Fred just weeks after murder, found after he swallowed sleeping pills in a Florida hotel room. The note didn't confess, but revealed everything: guilt, regret, fear. And then came the child, Sarah's 6-year-old son, the only eyewitness. The boy had watched his mother die, had touched her blood, had saved his brother. And now, in a quiet courtroom, with a stuffed animal in one hand, he whispered the words no one would ever forget. He made Mommy drive, and then he shot her. The jury deliberated for hours, maybe less. And when they returned, they carried not just a verdict, but a reckoning. Guilty on racketeering, on money laundering, on conspiracy, on murder for hire, on murder. Fred Tokars, the former judge, the family man, the polished Atlanta lawyer, was sentenced to 4 life terms without the possibility of parole. He would never see freedom again. Not in this life. Not in any. But for the FBI, this wasn't just about putting a man behind bars. This was about proving that no one, no matter how educated, connected, or protected, is above the law. They didn't just follow clues. They followed character flaws through paper trails, fake names, and secret counts. They traced a murder not from a crime scene, but from a boardroom. And in doing so, they proved that justice doesn't care what title a man wears, only what choices he makes In the dark, the verdict echoed like thunder through every courtroom hallway in Georgia. Fred Tokars, guilty, for life sentences. No parole, no appeals left to run. But the gavel didn't end the story. It only closed a chapter. What followed was quieter, colder, the kind of aftermath that never makes the headlines. Because what Fred Tokars destroyed wasn't just a life. It was a family. Sarah's 2 sons, the only witnesses to her murder, were now motherless, fatherless, and trapped in the memory of that night. The older one, just 6 years old at the time, had grown up overnight. Forced to describe, in courtroom whisper, the look on his mother's face when the gun fired. No child should carry that weight. He had saved his brother, shut off the car, and walked barefoot into the darkness to find help. And now, he would carry a lifetime of silence. The Tokars estate was tangled in legal knots, tied up in civil suits, guardianship battles, and claims from the very drug dealers Fred once helped protect. The truth had torn away every illusion of respectability. The country club connections, the courtroom decorum, the family man persona. Fred Tokars was now nothing more than federal inmate #54834-019, confined to a small, windowless cell in a high-security penitentiary, the very kind of place he used to lecture about from behind a podium. But even behind bars, Fred wasn't finished scheming. The FBI kept eyes on him, quietly, cautiously. There were whispers that he was still pulling strings, that he'd buried money somewhere, that offshore funds hadn't been fully traced. He refused to cooperate with financial recovery efforts, refused to show remorse, refused to admit guilt. He had nothing but time, and he was still trying to control the narrative. But time was a mirror Fred couldn't escape. In prison, he faded, not from illness, but from irrelevance. The name that once carried clout in legal circles was now just a cautionary tale, a warning about arrogance, about double lives, about the lengths to which a man will go to avoid losing control. For the agents who had worked the case, some of the best the Bureau had to offer, the satisfaction was tempered. Yes, they had unraveled a complex murder-for-hire conspiracy. Yes, they had pierced the armor of a man who thought he was untouchable. But they'd also looked into the eyes of a child and seen what true trauma looked like. It wasn't just about forensics or phone taps or financial records. This case, the Sarah Tokars case, was about truth, a quiet, personal truth, that monsters don't always hide in alleyways or behind ski masks. Sometimes they sleep in your bed, they kiss your children goodnight, they teach the law while breaking it behind closed doors. The FBI knew they had done more than solve a case. They had protected a future. Because if Sarah Tokars had lived in fear, then her death would not be in vain. Her courage to speak out, to gather evidence, to fight for her children, had left a trail. And that trail had led straight to the man who believed no one could touch him, until the Bureau did. Years passed. The cameras faded. The courtrooms emptied. And the name Fred Tokars, once shouted across headlines, became a footnote in legal journals. A whispered story passed between prosecutors and agents over cold coffee and thicker case files. But inside the Bureau, his case never truly disappeared. It became a case study. They called it textbook. A deep-cover conspiracy wrapped in domestic routine. A husband, a lawyer, a father, all of it a disguise. Behind it, the mechanics of greed, precision, paranoia. A man who built his world out of facades, corporations, and clean shoes, until it all crumbled under the weight of his own control. Fred Tokars didn't lose because of a mistake. He lost because he believed he was smarter than everyone else. But the FBI, they don't deal in appearances. They follow patterns. Pressure points, paper trails, phone clicks. They wait, and then they strike. New agents still study the Sarah Tokars case. They read the affidavits. They traced the timelines. They learn how conspiracies breathe, how they hide behind other people's names, how they bleed through offshore wires and dusty filing cabinets. They also learn something else, something darker, that even in the cleanest suburbs, even among the most respectable faces, there are predators. And sometimes the person who poses the greatest threat is the one sitting across the dinner table. Sarah Tokars' death became more than a tragedy. It became a lesson in how courage takes many forms, including the quiet act of collecting papers in secret and trusting in the family, knowing that someday someone might need them. It was her voice, through those documents, those warnings, those final conversations, that lit the fuse. It was her strength that set the case in motion. And it was the FBI who picked up that signal, followed it through the fog, and brought down a man who believed he was too clean, too careful, too clever to ever get caught. Fred Tokars died behind bars. Not violently, not dramatically, just quietly, in the same silence he once imposed on his wife. But the story doesn't end with his death. It ends with the truth, standing in full light, with two boys who survived something no child should ever face, and found healing in the care of those who stepped up when their parents couldn't, with agents who worked nights, holidays, and through setbacks, because justice doesn't keep office hours, and with a system that, in this case, did exactly what it was built to do. In the shadows of Atlanta's quiet neighborhoods, a woman fought to protect her family, and lost her life doing it. But because of that fight, the man who tried to bury her truth was buried by it instead. And that, as the Bureau would say, is justice served.